Greetings to my vibrant, accomplished colleagues. My remarks today are an impression, not a chronology, of my most personal journey through a life of the mind in search of the soul of that life. Breathe, move, reflect. My hands were sanitized and encased in purple gloves. The harried nurse gently handed me the baby, tethered to myriad monitors and feeding tubes. Flailing in agitation, baby Shayna was begging to be calmed. The nurse knew that the calming was necessary, not just nice, for the baby to restore normal respiration and stasis. My own blood pressure surely rose immediately as I held the writhing 3-pound bundle. The flailing increased. The high-pitched, the weakened walls and wails convulsed in that little body. In my own panic, I realized that we both needed to breathe. We locked eyes. Her tiny arms picked away at my face. I slowed my own breath, held her even more firmly high on my chest, kept my eyes on hers, rocked slowly, so slowly, side to side, and blew gently near her forehead. It seemed an eternity. I calmed. She calmed. In that moment, I felt we had found a state of grace. 6 days before the pandemic lockdown, I served what would be my last shift at St. David's Hospital as a rocker in the neonatal intensive care unit. Although I have the right hair color, the job in reality is not the conjured one of a sweet-faced Mrs. Doubtfire singing lovely nursery rhymes to docile infants swaddled in designer pinks and blues. It's a rocker, working in tandem with the nurses to sustain a tiny life. What, you may be asking, does this have to do with a life in the theater? Well, for me, it's a microcosm and a profound encapsulation of over 40 years of nearly relentless work. Basic to all those years for me was a constant testing of what the creative life was about. How to make sense of institutions and preparing artists. How to make a life of the mind merge with the life of the soul. How to understand the epic and the familiar. It was also a tiny distillation of the basic dramatic structure: stasis, inciting incident, conflict, crisis, climax, and return to a renewed and changed stasis. Rather than reflecting on achievements and failures, I found my time in semi-retirement reflecting on my own inner work. Although I earned a PhD from Michigan, I bucked the expectations of a strictly scholarly career and developed my academic work as a professor of practice, steeped in the analysis and intellectual inquiry into texts, but demonstrated in the verbal, spatial, and time-based art of live theater. It was a gloriously two-pronged career in both the academy and the theater. My father always expected that I would become a teacher. He said I was appropriately bossy. Little did he realize, and much to his chagrin and displeasure, that I would become a professional stage director, the ultimate in bossiness. Not having seen a stage play until I was in high school, I sure knew drama. As a light sleeper, even as a child, when my dad would work the night shift, my mother and I would watch TV dramas until 11 o'clock. We would tense up, cry, identify with the victims, admire the heroic medical professionals, worry through the details. I developed an unlikely interior life of emotional heft, but no place to put it. Eventually, I made my way, after years of a scientific path, including teaching biology dissection labs as an undergraduate, and a nearly completed master's degree in literature, to Michigan theater, where a whole brave new world opened up. Summer repertory casting in the major plays of Shaw, Shakespeare, and contemporary writers. Annual trips to the Stratford Festival in Canada to study Robin Phillips, Brian Bedford, Martha Henry. Serving as research associate for the UM Experimental Theater Festival interviewing Liz LeCompte, Spalding Gray, Judith Malina. Not only was I hooked on theater, but I knew too much what I didn't know. So I set upon an ongoing watching, learning, experimenting career that has taken me far and wide. Never with answers, but always with more observations, making intellectual connections, and manifesting these in practice. This practice has always resided in a creative tension between intellectual query of texts and performance skills, qualities in rhythm, composition, breath, voice, and athleticism. I wanted to feel at home in both classical and contemporary work. Let me share with you two such examples. Several years ago, I directed Richard III for the Utah Shakespeare Festival. My written director's notes to the producers and the design team were organized to distill my research and analysis into an inciting statement that would render the text manageable, understandable, and coherent for translation into visual, oral, and kinetic designs. I share with you portions of my statement. Point 1, situate the play. Originally seen as a weird creative blend of Senecan revenge tragedy and the popular chronicle story, the play has managed to entice the intellectual interests of Sigmund Freud in his study of personality, serve as metaphors for political scientists in their examination of leadership and power, and lure major theater and film actors into essaying the lead role. In the final analysis, the play is not a tragedy, not a history, and not a biopic. The play is Shakespeare's fiction, based on historical figures and literary conventions, which has more in common with melodrama than any other genre. Much like the contemporary film The Social Network, this play cuts close to historical accuracy and then veers off, appropriately, to develop themes of avarice, power, virtuosity, and mesmerizing presence. Point 2, specify the production parameters. For many textual and dramaturgical reasons, such as the explosive, shape-shifting personality of Richard, the malicious intent of many characters, the sexual lechery that affects Edward IV, the intense, perverse wooing scenes of both Anne and Elizabeth, I am drawn to the description of the Mannerist period in visual art. Using Wiley Cypher's definition of terms in his 4 stages of Renaissance style, the visual style for this production seems to me to be asymmetrical, twisted, eccentric, a tremor of malaise and distrust, thin or sour color, irrational. For overall composition and color, I was drawn to the works of Parmigianino, Tintoretto, and especially El Greco and the prisons of Piranesi. Point 3, suggest design details. Scenic pieces and architectural elements will help the film noir quality of the lighting, with use of traps, grates, shadowy painting of catacomb-like back walls and fog. Sound, music is a major design element, with a perverse take on ecclesiastical motifs, underscoring which parallels the scene rather than the character, and environmental sounds of birds of prey and nocturnal animals, tweaked into a deeply disturbing sound bed. The climactic fight scene is a hyperkinetic duel between Richmond and Richard that uses his disability to advantage. Point 4, articulate final impression. The goal is to devise a theatrical event that centers on Richard's virtuosity as a vital overreacher who is charismatic, erotic, ironic, humorous, and evil. The visual design, the superbly poetic language, the actor's athletic strengths, and the all-encompassing sound must unite to tell a horrific but commanding story of villainy. As Cypher writes, without even mentioning this play, our production must capture the idea that power degenerates into will into appetite, which at last eats up itself. Of course, this was only a start, a preparation. Yet the notes established what I recognize now in reflection are the key aesthetic principles that fuel my creativity. The text is the primary launch. Actors are like athletes for the stage. Their physicality and virtuosity are outsized in their intensity and skill. All elements are rhythmic as they are expressed and then experienced by the audience. Cueing, sound, and light cues rely on breath. Crisis and climax usually rely on actors' physical movement. The audience breathes and moves with them all. The reflection is the immediate after impression. Hold on to that image while I share a second experience. Nothing is more exciting in having a life in the theater than discovering a new voice. A playwright who grabs the tempo and tempests of his generation and renders them with the musicality of thought, rhythm, and language. Although my actors and I did not discover Terrell Alvin McCraney by any means, the rehearsal process turned out to be a discovery of sorts. To back up a bit, when two talented young Chicago actors approached me about directing this piece for them, I was touched by their enthusiasm, determination, and deep affection for McCraney's The Brothers' size. Of course, I gave them ridiculous challenges that they had to meet from the outset. One, I would not produce the play, I would only stage it. Second, they had to prepare for every rehearsal with lines learned immediately. And third, they had to be in expert health and physical condition in order to deal with the play's deep emotional tasks. Secretly, I was delighted to have this directing opportunity. I had fallen in love with McCraney's writing, his imagination, his erudition, his blending of contemporary social psychology and the heightened influence of Yoruban myths. The discoveries in our rehearsal process were multiple. The heartbreaking relationships between the spirit of iron and will in Ogun, the spirit of the wanderer Ochusi, and the spirit of the trickster Olegba. We relished the discoveries of the musical sources. We found deeper resonances of poetry. Gradually, we were unafraid of getting to the heart of young Black men's societal constraints and realized that these brothers of this generation and race live in an existential fear of identity formation and abandonment. But most importantly, we discovered genuine respect for each other, for discipline, for trust, for ensemble playing, and for the responsibility of revealing spiritual, personal truths. And so, I pushed them to exhaust themselves physically, mentally, and spiritually in bringing the brothers' size to life. And they pushed hard back due to their hunger for creativity and for putting their life experiences, both literal and imaginative, as South Side young men encountering a playwright as demanding as Shakespeare. The rehearsals and performances were exhausting, honestly painful, yet ultimately joyful. They had used their research skills, their commitment to athleticism, and their love of language and song for pure transcendence. Yet we found one scene particularly difficult to decipher. In scene 7, the three actors are faced with this language with no indication of locale or stage directions, other than the opening narrative line of Ochuzi. Let me share a bit of this text. Ochuzi Size says, Ochuzi Size begins walking to work. Ogun Size, step. Olegba, step. Ogun Size, step. Olegba, step. Ochuzi Size, hot sun on my back, hot in my face, hot. Olegba, step. The text continues like this, with pressure from Ogun and Olegba and Ochuzi revealing more ambiguous text. We could figure out the dynamic among them, but we couldn't get a handle on how to stage this, or actually what to stage. And then, miracle of miracles, overnight, my own deep unconscious brought forth a memory of sound, song. As a young child, I remembered hearing Harry Belafonte and probably other singers on the radio and especially on the television variety shows engaging in these unusual rhythms. I raced to the next day's rehearsal and I revealed to the actors that I thought this text referred to the chants of chain gangs in the South. Suddenly it made sense. Intellectually, we knew that Olegba and Ochuzi had been in prison, that Ogun was working valiantly to keep his brother out, and the pressures of their circumstances were bringing them to a crisis. We began to beat out rhythms, stomping for emphasis, keeping up a ruthless drive in the choreography of relentless circles with collapses in what I called the stations of the cross. The actors brought their experiences with call and response to the vocals, and even found a Belafonte snippet of melody to one repeating phrase. Within 5.5 pages of text, we found an iconic representation of the Black men's struggle with injustice and incarceration, all expressed primarily through breath, movement, and voice. At the end of the scene, after repetitions of text and increasing pressure, all 3 actors collapse over with fatigue and then resume with sweat, weakened voices, and bodies in the final coda of the scene. Well, it's hard. Lord Almighty, step. It's hard. Lord Almighty, mighty, step. It's hard. Lord Almighty, come on, boys, Awella. Enervated, they trudge off the scene with pickaxe and shovel in hand. We looked each other in the eyes and knew then that I, a blue-collar white woman in a position of seeming authority, and 3 young Black actors who matured in an instant, had suddenly reached an understanding of a blazing, suffocating social reality for which no essay or lecture could have prepared us. Our bodies now deeply knew the truth. Our creative work cemented our relationship to this day. As I write this, nearly a decade later, these actors have established the Definition Theater in Chicago, using our exploration of the brothers' size as their inaugural production. They have received a $1.6 million seed grant from the City of Chicago's Neighborhood Opportunity Fund to establish a theater center in Woodlawn. Their goals are to gather artists and activists to provide a safe place for theater making, provide career development opportunities for youth of color, and to serve as a business incubator for minority entrepreneurs. From our early conversations over a 3-hour Italian dinner, the actors refined their identity. We are a culturally diverse theater dedicated to telling language-driven, relationship-oriented, socially relevant stories about and created with underrepresented communities in Chicago. So what does this all mean now? The work I do and have done, the work I see and am moved by, all depend on a few key but substantive principles. The execution of the elements in production come back around to considerations of preparation, breath, movement, and reflection. I confess to you, I'm still grieving the last 5 years. Our politics, our debasement of language and thought, the need for Black Lives Matter campaigns, the pandemic, the loss of employment in the arts and across our society, the insurrection, the mistrust of expertise, the collapse of ethics and order. But you know, that as theater makers, we have the power to breathe life into words, lift words into action, act with design and intention, celebrate ideas, thrive with artistic ambiguity, build actor-athletes who can startle us with moments of virtuosity. In my life now, I want to think big. and start small again. I will return to St. David's and hold a different, distraught baby in my arms. I will breathe with her, hold her close, and rock her side to side. Soon, perhaps, that tiny life will lift herself up. What life will you breathe into our theater and our humanity? Thank you, dear colleagues, for this opportunity to speak with you today.